Welcome to the Ranchonomics podcast, where we empower you to build a better ranch and transform your operations into a thriving business. I'm your host, John Haskell. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Ranchonomics podcast. We're going to do something different today. I do not have a guest. I am going to record a solo episode to address a trend that I am seeing in a lot of businesses that we work with that seems to have a very big impact on the economic and financial outcomes of the businesses that we look at. I'm going to talk today about something called the Kiyosaki Ratio. We've introduced this in a few places in our webinars. I talk about this in some of my public speaking engagements, but I really want to make sure and illustrate how powerful this is. The Kiyosaki Ratio is pretty simple. It is literally the total of cash flow producing assets that you own divided by your total assets. And what we're trying to estimate here is how much of the stuff you own actually makes money. Now, I'm going to assume we're a profitable business for now with a reasonable gross margin and a number of other things. I want to visit about gross margin because the concept of the Kiyosaki Ratio is fairly similar to the gross margin concept in the sense that in the ranching for profit ecosystem and in EL boards, we often examine our gross margin carefully to see if an enterprise is worth pursuing. Well, this Kiyosaki Ratio gives us even a larger business level view of, again, how much of our assets are actually working for us. Now, we have two types of assets, and I'm going to follow Robert Kiyosaki's definition of asset, which he cites in his books, most notably Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but he cites it in the cash flow quadrant and most other things. He writes his definition of an asset is something that puts cash in your pocket. So he gives two examples. One is the home you live in compared to a rental house that you own. The home you live in does not put cash in your pocket, even though it gives you a place to live. Whereas if you own a rental house that someone else rents, and again, assuming it's positive cash flow, that puts cash in your pocket. The car you drive, the bank considers that an asset, but generally does not put cash in your pocket unless you're using that car as a, delivery vehicle or something like, you're in the business of cars. But for me, for example, our pickup truck only takes money out of my pocket. It requires tires and oil changes and fuel. I have a friend that is in the car business. When he owns a vehicle, that puts money in his pocket. So the same asset can be classified different ways. But most importantly, we want to draw a distinction between the bank's definition of an asset versus Kiyosaki's definition. And I want to stay fairly true to Kiyosaki's definition, if we may. Although I occasionally will get the definitions wrong, I hope I can do it correctly while we're talking here. The important thing is that when we look at an enterprise in a ranching for profit framework or in our Ranch Right financials, we often look at the gross margin, meaning what percent of the gross product that we produce results in gross profit. Gross profit, if you recall, is the gross product minus the direct costs, and that is money that is available to pay overhead, service debt, create profit in the business, reinvest in the business, etc. That gross profit number, or sometimes referred to as the gross margin number, is a very important number because it tells us about the efficiency of that enterprise. We've done interviews on this before with Sarah Delavan, for example. If your gross margin is too low, there isn't enough money left over to pay overheads and to service debt. And if your gross margin is high, it leads to wonderfully positive situations for the business where it's easier, for example, to build cash reserves, it's easy to service debt, it's easy to grow the business. Now, the Kiyosaki Ratio becomes important because as we dilute our capital into more and more things that don't make money, we handicap the business. And what we see, I'll pick a little on two different groups here, but farmers, for example, generally have a lot of money tied up in equipment and stuff that doesn't produce cash flow, whereas a ranch operation can exist without much equipment, without much stuff. And, the majority of its assets can be actually things that produce cash flow, like livestock, especially with the price of livestock right now being very high. Most breeding herds are very valuable and are producing good cash flow. So here's what I want to look at. We see a range from, 10% as a Kiyosaki ratio to almost 100. But let's say 20 to 80 is the normal range. And what that means at the low end is 20% of the money is generating cash flow, or 80% of the money invested is generating cash flow. I want to start at the high end and work down to the low end. If I have opening assets of about $500,000 and I have an 80% Kiyosaki ratio, that means I have $400,000 invested in cash flow producing assets. So let's just say, for sake of example, I have $400,000 in livestock. Let's back up just a minute. Examples of cash flow producing assets in a ranch scenario are stocker cattle, breeding ewes, yearling sheep, lambs, and feed. Okay, so things that do not produce cash flow in a ranch setting include tractors, implements, tools, fencing, water, that sort of thing. So I don't get paid to fence the cattle. I don't get paid to own a tractor. I may have to own a tractor in order to be able to keep the cattle alive. That's a different thing. But I don't generate an income from those. Now, we can argue about if I have a custom haying business, then my tractor can be a cash flow producing asset. That's a different question. I want to stay in the ranch context for the purpose of this discussion. So let's just assume that I have $500,000 invested, $400,000 of it is in cash flow producing assets or livestock. So that means $100,000 is in other stuff. And in our part of the world, that easily could be a tractor and some equipment to feed hay. If I assume that we have about a 50% equity, meaning about 50% of my ranch is in debt or, leveraged, and I have a gross margin of about 70%, I could have a gross product off that $400,000 of, let's say, $300,000, and then a gross profit or a gross margin of $210,000. That $210,000 of gross profit is what I can use to pay my overheads, and let's assume that's $50,000 for now. The fun thing about non-cash flow producing assets is not only do they not produce cash, but they usually take money out of your pocket through depreciation, repairs and maintenance, fuel, interest, etc. So in this case, if I've got $100,000 in non-cash flow producing assets, I'm going to say it costs me about 15% per year to own that asset. So what that leaves me is a net income of about $145,000. I'm going to run through that one more time. Start with $500,000 in assets. $400,000 of it is livestock. $100,000 is stuff. I generate about a $300,000 gross product. I take off 30% as direct costs, leaving me $210,000 in gross profit. I pay $50,000 in overheads. I pay $15,000 in depreciation, maintenance, fuel, and interest, leaving me with $140,000. That gives me a return on assets of about 30% and a return on equity of almost 60%. If I start that with $500,000 and I run that business for 10 years, and the pattern is the same, I continue reinvesting the profit, I could wind up with a value in that business or imagine the compound growth in that business could get me to about $3.2 million after about 10 years. If I drop down to the 20% Kiyosaki ratio, I am going to see a very different result. And it's pretty easy to imagine why. Now, when I start here, I start with $500,000 of total assets. I have $100,000 that produces cash flow and $400,000 that does not produce cash flow. Now, as we just talked about, the $400,000 is going to cost me more because I'm charging 15% repairs and maintenance and interest on that $400,000. I have a lot less income generating power with only $100,000 invested in cash flow producing assets. If I have the same 50% equity and a similar gross product turnover, I wind up with a gross product of $75,000. And then with a 70% gross margin, I wind up with a gross profit of $52,500. And if that has to service $50,000 in overheads and $60,000 in fixed asset maintenance, so again, depreciation, interest, fuel, repairs, etc., now I've generated a $57,000 loss. That's a 12% loss on assets and a 23% loss on equity. And if I do a 10-year compounded growth of that business, I start with $500,000 and end after 10 years with negative $325,000. Now, my point here is not to pick on farmers who own a lot of equipment or to say that if you only own cows, you're always going to be successful. But I want you to really think about the idea that it is much easier to be profitable in ranching when you don't have to own a lot of stuff. Now, the stuff that we're talking about, which we often refer to as PPE or property, plant, and equipment, is all of the stuff that doesn't make you money. And that stuff may be essential. And I don't want anybody to get the idea that, if you live in a place like Montana or Wyoming or North Dakota, that you should be reckless and get by with less than the equipment you need. But please understand that if you do require a lot of equipment, that ties up a lot of capital in things that generate costs. They don't generate income and puts your business as a severe disadvantage. And the compounded effects of that over a 10-year period are fairly significant. Struggling to break into the tight-knit world of ranching? Connect, compete, and grow with our new networking platform. Real ranchers, real insights, real opportunities. Visit ranching.fyi and click forums. I want to reemphasize this, that in small business, one of our most powerful tools is the ability to compound our profits. Now, what does that mean? We're talking about today the assets that make money. Well, fantastically, when we make money and reinvest it in the business, that money that we make also makes money. The way I've done the calculations here are fairly specific, and I've used some, I think, fairly conservative rules. But when we reinvest basically half of your net income at the end, and we assume, a reasonable rate of return as dictated by the model here, we see that the difference between basically an $825,000 loss over the course of 10 years versus what would the difference be? $2.7 million gain is pretty dramatic. Now, the difference between 80% Kiyosaki ratio and 20% Kiyosaki ratio is pretty extreme. We do see lots of 50%, businesses in the range of 50% Kiyosaki ratio. But if we can grow past that, the leverage gets really large. Let's run through a 50%er just to, again, demonstrate the point and to really show how the compounding effect works. If we again start with $500,000 in opening assets, we have half of that, or $250,000, that's actually producing cash flow. That gives us a gross product that is on the order of $188,000, let's say. Staying consistent with our 70% gross margin, we've got a gross profit of $131,000. We pay overheads of $50,000. We pay depreciation, maintenance, fuel, interest of $37,500. That gives us a net income of $44,000, which is about a 10% ROA, or return on asset, and an 18% ROE. Remember, we're 50% financed. And that gives us a 10-year value of $578,000. Again, I've made some rules about how I do the compounding there. I have assumed that we don't reinvest all of the net income. We only reinvest half of it. But what you see is at 20%, we're at negative $325,000 after 10 years. At 50%, using all the same basic parameters, we're at basically $600,000. And at 80%, we're at $3.2 million. So this thing has a lot of power and a lot of leverage. And if you're ignoring the leverage in this, I think you're making a big mistake. When I think about the war on costs, I've told many audiences that I think after doing an initial ranching for profit class, most people get sufficiently concerned about overheads and direct costs and begin cutting those. Bert Teichert talks about having a continuous war on cost. I'm absolutely supportive of that. But I think after you have gotten costs to a certain level, you need to start thinking about revenue. That's the place we often don't think enough about. That's one of the reasons we talk about marketing, for example, because marketing adds revenue without adding any direct or indirect costs. That said, another big piece of increasing revenue is making sure that what we own makes money. When we look at the relationship between the balance sheet and the P&L, one of the things I want to see is that growth in the balance sheet leads to growth in the P&L. We want to do two things. We want to retain earnings from our P&L, reinvest them in the balance sheet so that our P&L gets bigger over time. And when both of those things are happening, right, you're moving money from your P&L onto your balance sheet through profit, then that profit can be used to then improve the future state of the business. Whether we are talking about tax planning or we are talking about generating intergenerational wealth, the concept is basically the same. We want to own things that make money. We want as much of our money as possible making money. If I take money and invest it in the stock market, obviously, the more money I invest, the better. If I keep half of it out or half of it in underperforming equities, for example, I will do less well than someone that has all of it in high-performing equities. I don't want to get too wrapped up in the details of that. I always want to have some stuff in something like cash as insurance. But the more money I have making money, the easier it is to make money. I hope you can understand kind of what we're talking about here. I hope you can look at your business and see ways where you could pull money out of non-performing or non-cash flow generating assets and convert it to a cash flow generating asset. We had a great discussion a few months ago with a customer who likes to invest in antique trucks and fix them up. We went through some basic math with him where we said, okay, what if you took that same amount of money and bought heifer calves with that? And they have a very profitable business. They run a very nice return on their heifers. When we looked at what would happen there of going from an asset that basically costs money to one that would make money to own, the difference in the impact it would have in their business was very, very impressive. Enough to really get a person thinking about, man, maybe we should sell a couple of these things that we don't really use and convert that into livestock that we know can make money. Anyway, I hope this is helpful. Hopefully you see the importance of the Kiyosaki ratio. I'd love to hear questions about this. This is a topic that's come up multiple times in our webinars. I think this is an underlooked or an underappreciated part of our business. And I hope that learning more about the Kiyosaki ratio helps you win today. And we will talk more soon. Thank you. Thank you for tuning into the Ranchonomics podcast. We hope this episode helped you win today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend.